It is my great pleasure to present to you Dirk Helbing, one very interdisciplinary researcher. What we can take from his short CV, which I will present to you right now. Dirk Helbing studied physics and mathematics, but as always, as he tells, has always been interested in other fields of sciences as well, for example, in sociology. In 2000, he became professor and managing director of the Institute for Transport and Economics at Dresden University of Technology, and in 2007, he was appointed professor of sociology, in particular of modeling and simulation at FuturICT. The main research interests focus on the understanding of complex systems. Starting from the study of traffic dynamics, he extended his research interests to socio-economic systems, such as companies and, right now, whole societies. Dirk Helbing is, right now, the head of the FuturICT initiative, major research program, seeking to connect multiple networks, social networks, and data for purposes of social simulation and political advisory. Dirk Helbing has very numerous publications in many fields, and I spare to go into that. I just hand over the microphone and welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the introduction and invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I'd also like to thank the audience for the interest in this subject. FuturICT is a response to the European Commission's flagship call, and that is actually a call for projects of the order of 1 billion euros, they said. It seems that the budget will be a bit smaller, but the question basically was at that time, what could you do good with 1 billion euro? And this is a competition in the area of ICT, that means information communication technology. And we decided to put society in the center of our attention, and we want to create new science and technology to understand and manage our complex world in a more sustainable and resilient way. Now, the starting point actually of our considerations is the fact that we are living in an age of information. This picture over here is signalizing that information is becoming more important for some people than actually material resources, and this is going to change a lot. I just want to give you a few keywords that are characterizing the change of our society in the next years. First of all, big data will create more information in the next years in the past 1,000 years. It means in the whole history of humanity. What does that mean? Within the next 10 years, computers will reach brain power. That means their abilities will compare and compete with those of humans. Then, hyperconnectivity. We have connected billions of components, mobile phones, computers, factories, cars, everything. They will also talk not only to you, but to your coffee machine, to your fridge, and basically everything on Earth. We are also entering a situation of cyber-social systems where the boundaries between the virtual and real world are blurred. And we're entering a situation where we're able to create innovation from information, means make big money from big data. But we can't anymore do business as usual, and that was the starting point of the project. So Sandy Packard put it quite bluntly. He said, our financial, transportation, and health systems are broken. Period. And somehow, if you listen to the news, you think, okay, why do we have, again, to fix our health insurance system? Why do we always have traffic jams? Why do we have a financial crisis? So there's something in this. And Geoffrey West as I read, one of the 100 most influential people some years back. He was president of the Santa Fe Institute, a big think tank in the United States. He said, we're seeing an extraordinary phase of our current political and economic system. I'm not sure you agree with that, but we all know there are problems around, and some of those problems are listed here. So for sure we are facing a situation of intensified or even new global problems, such as the world financial, economic, and debt crisis, social and political instabilities in many countries, actually, global environmental change, organized crime, cybercrime, the quick spreading of new diseases. And so, the goal and vision of this project is that we want to better understand society, or more generally, socially interactive system, and their dependency on main driving factors, resources, environment, demographic change, finance, and so on. Well, we have networked the world, and networking is good. We have now a global exchange of people, of goods, of ideas, of money, and that allows us to do many things. It's really fantastic. But also, this globalization and technological change have created a strongly coupled, interdependent world, and the network infrastructure is creating pathways for disaster spreading. I'd like to show you a video that stimulates your imagination, which is showing table tennis balls on top of mouse traps. And we'll just drop one single table tennis ball, that will have a local perturbation. And we'll see that this is going to mix up the whole system. Let me see, maybe I can get some noise as well. This is a funny example, of course, but the point is that in our real world we see many cascading effects. Of course, each cascading effect is different. And one example over here is the blackout of the European power grid, which is quite astonishing because on November 4, 2006, a single electricity line was turned off. And as a result of that, we've had blackouts all over Europe, even in Spain and Portugal. You can see that this is a quite complex pattern of electricity failure, and it demonstrates us that complex networks, complex systems are really hard to predict in their behavior. By the way, there are actually simulation tools in order to check what would happen if you turn off one line, but then it seems another one failed at the same time that created these cascading effects. Well, there's a huge collateral damage, a huge cost of these problems that I mentioned before to society. A natural crisis is costing us $2 to $20 trillion. Conflicts, 1.5 trillion per year. Terrorism has a huge impact. Crime and corruption as well. Epidemics, and also cybercrime, with 750 billion euros per year in Europe. So, if we just manage to improve those systems by 1%, a project like FuturICT would pay off multiple times. We actually think, however, that we can improve those systems by 10% or even 30% based on experiences gained in other complex systems. So the issue is really to understand those systems in order to come up with new solutions. One thing that we need to understand better is interaction effects. There was another cascading effect on May 6, 2010, the so-called flash crash. $600 billion evaporated in just 20 minutes, and it turned solid stocks into penny stocks. It took months to investigate this case, and It turned out it was not a criminal act, it was not a mistake, it was not a programming error, it was an interaction effect. So basically, in our information communication systems, things are happening that we don't want to happen. Actually, those systems are now based on automated trading. More than 50% of financial trades are done by computers, actually some of the fastest computers in the world. And they are trying to get an overview of their environment, in this case the financial environment. They're trying to project in the future, they're communicating with other systems, they're taking autonomous decisions. They behave in many respects like humans. We have created, even without knowing, artificial social systems. And that means we need to understand how these systems work. We are highly dependent on the information communication technologies. Everything depends on them today. So we depend on their reliability. It's critical infrastructures. But if we don't understand how socially interactive systems work, we'll have a lot of problems. The very same problems that we have in our society. Like coordination, failures, breakdowns of cooperation, conflicts, wars, crime, all these kind of things can happen. And in fact, we see that cybercrime is exploding exponentially. Not even since a year we're talking about cyber wars. So these things are happening. We need to understand socially interactive systems in order to learn how to design these systems, so not just the components are going to work fine, but also the interactions will have favorable outcomes, or at least not damaging systemic outcomes. As we have them today, unfortunately. So here is a video prepared by a colleague that shows you the bankruptcy of American banks over time. And it looks like a thunderstorm, actually. Unfortunately, it's much more devastating than a thunderstorm. Actually, hundreds of banks have gone bankrupt, and it created losses of hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is more or less this table tennis ball example I showed you before. It looks very similar. Of course, the details are different, but no, this is not funny anymore. We started to think about this project in 2008 when the OECD had a global science forum about the issue of complexity in governance. It was in 2008, and I said at that time, I think we're at the verge of a financial crisis at large scale. At that time, people still said, no, we'll fix it. So it's a problem, but not a big one. But I said at that time, I think we don't understand those systems well enough. Nobody does. Not just scientists, also bankers, insurance experts, politicians. Nobody understands these systems well enough. And so I said, we need to have a large-scale project on socioeconomic systems to get this understanding eventually. And this is important. It's important for all of our lives, actually. And eventually people understood that we need such a project. Well, somebody put it even more drastically than I did. Warren Buffett, one of the richest persons in the world, has stated in 2003 that we would basically see an investment time bomb. He was warning of mega catastrophic risks for the economy. And it sounds like a little bit crazy to use these words, like bomb and all these kind of things, but when you think about it, it turns out the analogy is not so bad, actually. It took 5 more years, as we know, until this bomb exploded or actually imploded, but in principle the issue is that we need to understand much better the strongly coupled systems that we have created. And one of the systems that we know involve strong couplings are actually nuclear reactions, as we have in our atomic power stations. And the mousetrap example that I showed you before is exactly a demonstration of the chain reactions that go on in a nuclear power station. So we know that these processes can be controlled, but they're hard to control, and they may get out of control with a certain, very small, but still finite probability. And if those systems get out of control, there will be a tremendous cost to society. So we need to be very much aware of all the systems that are strongly coupled, and we're just creating an extremely strongly coupled system, which is our world's information communication system. Well, in fact, for 30 years or so, having globalized our world and pushed for technological revolutions, but we lack the science to understand the system that we have created. A global system science that allows us to understand not only the components of the systems, but also the effects of the interactions of those components. And as we started to think about it and search for the knowledge about these systems, you were actually shocked how little science knows, or anybody knows, about these systems that we have created. Now, it wouldn't be too bad if we could understand those systems based on the properties of the system components. But as I will argue later on, this is not the case. So we need new knowledge, and in particular we need to create a science of systemic risk. We need to push complexity theory from analogies towards practical impact. And for that we need a lot of data actually to have useful models that can inform us about real systems. And that requires a new data science. In particular, we need to be able to distinguish useful from useless information. Information that has an impact will finally enter our history books from information that is basically junk information and that won't have any impact. We also need to learn how to do integrated systems design, so that the interaction of those components of our, for example, information communication system would create favorable outcomes and not flash crashes, for example, or cybercrime. And we need to learn how the society will co-evolve with information and communication technologies and vice versa. So, huge knowledge gaps to fill, but this is not all, as it turned out. It's not just, okay, there is a lack of science, so we put some money into new science and eventually it will be there. No, actually, it turned out that we learned it basically from the interactions with the media, that it's more than just creating knowledge, it's about changing the way of our thinking. And what I want to claim is that our thinking determines what we see. Yeah? Here is an illustration of this cat that was raised in a cage with vertical bars. Actually, this experiment has been done with pigeons, I think, so it's not just made up completely. And now, after some time, we put this cat into another cage with horizontal bars, and will not be able to see those. That is kind of a little bit overstated claim, but in principle, that is what we find. So, we won't be able to see certain things because our cognition and our way of thinking has not been trained to see certain things. And that means we have to overcome the limitations of our conventional thinking. I will give a few examples later on. But before I do that, I'd like to start with another example of a historical paradigm shift in thinking. Yeah? As you remember, we started off with the belief that the Earth would be in the center of the universe. I now believe that the Earth is oscillating around the Sun in elliptical pathways. And it started off with a man called Galileo Galilei, and he made some bold statements about the falling of bodies, and I need somebody to help me with an experiment. So who would like to assist me? It's not dangerous, so... Okay, great, fantastic. So we have two bodies here. I'm giving them to you. A heavy one and a light one. I guess everybody agrees this is the heavy stuff, and this is just a piece of paper, you know. And so the question is, what do you think? Will those two objects, if we drop them at the same time, will they arrive at the floor at the same point in time? Who thinks that's going to happen? Come on. Yeah, okay. Very good. At least one courageous person. Who thinks that this is going to be first on the floor? This small piece of paper. Nobody, huh? I thought there were some people from the humanities with creative thinking.
Will you leave the paper unchanged?
Who thinks this will arrive first?
Will you leave the paper unchanged?
Yeah, I'm going to change.
It really depends on how you drop it.
You're not cheating here. Okay, who thinks this is going to be first? Okay, and who doesn't have an opinion? There were quite a few people who didn't lift the arms, huh? Anyway, so we'll make this experiment. I'll count down 3, 2, 1, 0, and then you jump it, okay? 3, 2, 1, 0. All right. That was quite clear. Yeah. But we'll make another experiment. And what we do now is to just put this with both hands, and I just put it on top. I don't fix it. If somebody doesn't believe it, you can just check it. Everybody believes it? So you just put this piece of paper on top. Okay, now I count again. 3, 2, 1, 0. And see, surprisingly now, both objects are falling at the same speed. So please give an applause. Now, when Galileo Galilei claimed that all bodies would fall at the same speed, that was kind of unusual. And it was basically so unusual that they put him actually to prison, because that had important implications. It changed the world of physics. It was threatening the picture that religions at that time were spreading. It took 350 years to apologize for putting him to jail. If I remember well, he actually even withdrew his claims. So today we know he was right. But what was so shocking about this observation? Well, really, today it's not so surprising, but this transition from a flat Earth to a circular Earth, or from the Earth in the center of the world to the Sun in the center of the world, is really changing the worldview of people dramatically. And in the same way, I claim, will our worldview have to change. And why is that? Because strongly coupled systems behave in a completely different way from loosely coupled systems. In loosely coupled systems, the properties of the systems are given basically by the properties of the component. You just add up those properties. If you understand the components, you understand the system. It's well predictable, well controllable, fine. However, we have created a strongly coupled world. And that world is characterized by a number of properties that we can predict for strongly coupled systems, and actually we will finally conclude that this is actually what we do observe today, and that's the root of the problems that we have. We have a faster dynamics, an increased frequency of extreme events. Self-organization dominates the system dynamics. There emergent counterintuitive system behaviors, unwanted feedback cascading side effect. The predictability goes down. External control is difficult. Those systems are more vulnerable. Yes, I think everybody would say, you've seen these systems now, and they're bothering us. And it implies that we need to change our perspective, and namely from a component-oriented view to an interaction-oriented view. And as we do that, we will learn to find new solutions to old problems. In the same way as this change from this geocentric worldview to a heliocentric worldview has allowed us to launch satellites and come up with modern physics that is the basis of all our gadgets today. So changing our perspective is essential to find solutions. Now, you may not still believe that. That's why I brought a number of examples showing you that things go wrong if we have a strong coupling. Strong coupling in traffic means a high density. Yeah? So here we have, actually my Japanese colleagues have asked drivers to drive in a circle, avoid an accident, but keep going as much as they can. And this is what you find. So it works beautifully for some time. Now there was a perturbation, it goes away. And now there is another perturbation, you can see that. And as the traffic breaks down, there is a traffic jam, cars are stopped. Nobody wants this. Why the hell is this happening? They have all a driving license. If you would ask people, they would say, well, there was a bloody driver in front of me who didn't know how to drive a car. And of course, everybody would say that. But this is not the point. The point is that above a certain density, traffic flow becomes unstable. And no matter how well you drive, no matter how hard you try to avoid stopping, you can't do that. You will fail to do that with the best intentions and the best education. And how does it happen? Well, there are small variations in the speed, of course. Of course, you cannot control your car perfectly. And so, the next driver basically has to respond to that, but there is a reaction time. It takes some time to respond. And in order to compensate for this delay, you have to tip the brake a little bit stronger. The next one even stronger, so there is the chain reaction. And in the end, cars are stopped. So, interaction, perturbation, chain reaction, and there is the problem. So could it be that many of the problems that we have in our world are of this nature? That it doesn't need a criminal to create a mess. It's just that maybe we have created the systems in the wrong way. And suddenly we have a flash crash. Or something else. My claim is that many of the problems are exactly of this nature. Conflicts, wars, revolutions, all systemic instabilities. Drought disasters. Now, at small couplings, that means small densities, pedestrians organize beautifully. You can see these lanes of uniform walking direction. People rarely have to stop, so it's really a fluid organization. It's actually a self-organization. Nobody else to tell those people what to do. If you would ask them what they've done, they would not even have noticed that they had this lane formation. It happens automatically through those interactions. It's like Adam Smith's invisible hand that creates order in a magic way. And for a long time, people have believed that this order would happen automatically under all circumstances in the market, until we had the financial crisis. Yeah? And actually, some people still think Adam Smith is always valid. You know, when basically our understanding of Adam Smith is if everybody acts in a selfish way, it's going to create a social benefit. You know, we'll have the best systemic outcome. Actually, he did never say it like this, but this is how he's paraphrased. And we know from a number of systems that self-organization does not necessarily create a desirable outcome if we push the system towards a limit. Like the stop-and-go traffic. Yeah, certainly nobody wants this, but it happens because we have pushed the system to its limits. Or here, crowd disasters, as it happened in Duisburg. The density was too high, things got out of control, not even hundreds of policemen could have controlled the situation at that time. When crowd turbulence happened, because the density was too high. It should never have had been so high. I don't want to show you this video because it's really shocking. And I'm claiming that if we don't take care, we'll have really a big mess also in information and communication systems, and I'm claiming that we have seen that mess and are still seeing it in financial systems. So, hyper-connected systems. Certainly we have connected systems much more. We have a much higher connectivity, and I brought you a video that shows a situation which is quite typical. Of course, it's a social dilemma situation that is mapped into this model over here. A social dilemma situation happens in many circumstances, like environmental exploitation, overfishing, tax evasion, pollution, all these kind of things. We know these things happen, these things are annoying, but basically it's a failure of cooperation. And why do we have this failure of cooperation? Because social dilemma situations are situations in which cooperation is unstable. That means no matter how hard we try, we'll end up with uncooperative behavior. You can see that in the lab when you do experiments with people. They would show 60, 70, 80% of cooperation in the beginning in those social dilemma games. Prisoner's dilemma game, for example. But then there are some people who basically serve on this cooperativeness, so-called free riders. So there's a temptation to not cooperate, and there's a risk to cooperate, basically, to be exploited by those few people who think, okay, it's nice to be in this world of where everybody is friendly, so I can cheat them, it creates an advantage for me. And, you know, some people start with that, and then other people say, okay, why should I be the stupid person cheated by other persons, so I'm not going to cooperate anymore, and in the end, people end up defecting. And there are no simple solutions to this. But neighborhood interactions actually are known to promote cooperation in these social dilemma situations. Here is where neighborhood is important, and where a situation where everybody interacts with everybody else actually will definitely create defection. That means a tragedy of the commons. And here is the simulation. So red is non-cooperative behavior, blue is cooperative behavior. You see they're interacting in a circle, everybody has two neighbors, And eventually they turn blue, that means they start cooperating because of these neighborhood interactions. And now we introduce eventually more and more links between people in a random way, so it becomes more and more connected. I'll see that at some point the connectivity is so high that cooperation breaks down. And nobody would think that. Why? Because you start connecting the system, it's fine. It has a benefit in the beginning, and so everybody would conclude it has a benefit, so let's go on networking the system. And it creates even more benefit. Okay, let's go on, network, 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 network. And then very suddenly, surprisingly, you have this regime shift unexpectedly where your system breaks down. And this is actually what has happened in the financial system. The financial system became globally connected. Basically every bank was connected with every other bank, at least through financial derivatives and financial trading, and also through lending and so on. So it created exactly that situation, and people were surprised that suddenly the financial system broke down. So that means we need to understand those complex, strongly coupled systems. It requires a different kind of thinking from us, but also it requires new instruments. We have created telescopes, microscopes, CERN, and gene sequencing machines in order to learn about the components of our physical and biological environment. Now we need to create instruments that allow us to understand the interactions of those systems and what results from that. And so what we propose within FuturICT is to bring data, models, and people together. That means to create systems to sense and understand, address what is the state of the world question, develop models to simulate and predict, to address what-if scenarios, what would happen if we did this or that, and then finally, what is it good for? We want to turn knowledge into wisdom and build for these platforms to explore and interact, involving people, and also will create an innovation accelerator. Now, how would it look like? So, the first component that serves to sense and understand is called the planetary nervous system. And you maybe know OpenStreetMap, where basically it's a crowdsourcing approach. You would donate GPS traces, and from this it would be possible to reconstruct the street network of the world, and it's provided for free to other people. And in particular, in this way, you can map, for example, the still existing infrastructure after a natural disaster. But also, in principle, from the many photographs that are out in the web, you could reconstruct the world around you. So, for example, you could see the Colosseum without even traveling to Rome, to avoid all these traffic jams and the chaos and mess. So these are basically hundreds of pictures that were taken and the perspectives, and you can put it together in your computer. It takes about a day, but then here we go. So we have a beautiful 3D reconstruction of this building without ever going to Rome. So it's kind of a free Google Street Map kind of approach, and 3D reconstruction of the world. And that can be done with, of course, any place in the world that sufficiently many people would photograph. Okay? So, of course, you must like the Brandenburger Tor. Huh? So, the point, however, is here that in contrast to those projects that are running based on sensor networks, we would not just map out the physical and biological world, but also try to get an overview of the techno-social economic world and measure the social footprint. The social footprint of human decisions and actions. What would be the implications if we do this or that? And also learn to measure social capital. And why is that? Social capital is the basis for economic value generation, for happiness and many other things. Trust, for example, or cooperativeness. It's a network-based quantity, so it results from our interactions. And it's hardly understood, it's hardly measurable, but it can be destroyed, it can be damaged, it can be exploited, like our environment. And that's why we need to protect it like our environment. No insurance today is taking into account damage to social capital, like trust. And just remember, the financial crisis is a crisis of trust. Banks don't trust each other anymore, customers don't trust their banks, and banks don't trust companies, they should lend money and so on. So that has basically destroyed thousands of billions of dollars. So trust has a value. And we need to understand what value it has. We need to protect it. And for this we need to learn how to measure it. So we want to create a measurement instrument for techno-socioeconomic environmental systems. And based on this, we could create new compasses for decision mechanisms. Know today that measuring GDP per capita is actually not a good measure of people's happiness. You need to consider health, environment, social well-being, education, many other things. So it would be nice if you could measure that real time and globally with data in the internet. And we believe it can be done, and we're working on that. Now all this data could be used to feed a living Earth simulator, to look a little bit around the corner into a short-term future, a possible future. I mean, we're talking about probabilistic events, and here's an example.
Today's high population densities and intense mobility increasingly threaten to push epidemics to pandemic proportions. The costs of such pandemics can be immense. Countless fatalities, untold physical and emotional pain, soaring healthcare costs, and supply chain disruptions. Now, with CLEAN, we can analyze how infections may spread globally and assess the best ways to minimize their impact. By combining epidemic models with real-world data, CLEAN produces simulations of the global spread of infectious diseases by integrating 3 layers. The first layer looks at people and their geographic distribution with respect to major transportation hubs. The second layer adds data on the mobility of the people, how they commute, and travel around the globe. The third and final layer adds the epidemic model, which can define complex disease scenarios and response strategies such as vaccination campaigns or emergency travel restrictions. Combining these 3 layers, CLEAN simulates epidemic spread at a worldwide scale.
Okay, so I'll
The resulting forecasts and
go
scenarios.
ahead because it'll take more time and time is short. But we can go one step further beyond simulation. Of course, we know that simulations require assumptions. Those assumptions are hard to test. We want to do that actually in lab experiments and web experiments, also by the use of interactive games as experimental platforms. So that means virtual worlds basically to test possible futures, possible new urban designs, that you could check out interactively, new financial architectures, other decision rules, and these kind of things. So rather than making assumptions about this, you can check it out before and decide for one option that you like most. Now I've talked a lot about complexity, and that is quite challenging. So is it the last battle, or can we manage it? And what I'm trying to say is that we need a paradigm shift towards flexible, adaptive systems, and it's possible in overdue, and very much related actually to this interaction-oriented picture that I showed you before, because interactions actually can create self-organization, like these examples over here show in an impressive way. So over here we don't have any traffic light, any policeman, and you can see almost never anybody has to stop. It's quite surprising. It's completely different kinds of vehicles and people and even donkeys and camels and everything. Now, it just works out beautifully by self-organization. So what I'm claiming is we can use self-organization for us. We shouldn't fight this natural tendency of the system. We need to learn how to use it for us. We call it guided self-organization. By small changes in the interactions, for example, we can get rid of certain problems, such as traffic jams. Like here is a simulation of the annoying stop-and-go ways we have discussed before. That's, by the way, a coffee meter. It's a measurement device that measures sudden changes in acceleration, so it should measure discomfort, like now, too much change in acceleration. So you can see this stop-and-go waves. And I have a special car, so I can turn it into a helicopter. And that allows me to see what is the reason for this annoying traffic jam. The reason is that those cars that try to squeeze themselves into the freeway are generating perturbations, and that are amplified and create stop-and-go waves. And now we're going to change the interaction of those cars, not changing the inflow. I just accelerate the presentation over here, not this period of time. And those cars now have they have sensors that measure the distance and relative velocity, and the cars respond to this information automatically and drive a little bit different from before. And by that, you can see that we can get rid of the traffic jams. So if interactions are a problem, then we have to change the interactions. That's the idea. Or the institutional settings. And we need to learn that, and for this we need to have this integrative systems design. Now we have another interesting application, which is traffic light control, where we said, well, couldn't we use these self-organized oscillations that we have observed among pedestrians at bottlenecks without a policeman or a traffic light? But then it's based on a pressure principle, and so we thought, okay, could it be that the traffic flows control the traffic lights? It's also a bottleneck, just for more flow directions. And that's what we have done. We have applied it actually also to parts of the city center of Dresden, where the authorities have basically given up. They were not satisfied with the state-of-the-art controls, wanted to have something better. I said, okay, you can try that. And you see, it came out very well for everybody. For public transport, individualized traffic, pedestrians and cyclists. And it's good for the environment as well. So we have learned, based on a decentralized, self-organized control principle that we call self-control actually, to use scarce resources much better than we can do today, even with powerful supercomputers. So it's a completely different paradigm. And basically, that can be generalized, because as systems become more complex, they become less controllable top-down. Why is that? Because many optimization problems are so-called NP-hard. That means that the computer power needed to solve those optimization problems explodes. And even your most powerful computers not be able to come up with an optimal traffic light control for Berlin or even much smaller cities. And if you cannot control it perfectly with a supercomputer and your systems become even more complex, you need to have a new paradigm to manage these systems. And it can only be more decentralization, more bottom-up participation. And that applies as well, I believe, to societies. And that's why I will come to this global participatory platform as the third instrument later. So we've also learned in similar ways to avoid crowd disasters, by the way. Again, the issue is to change the interactions, to have real-time information and an adaptive response to the situation. Yes, I already mentioned it, the global participatory platform. So the idea is to create a new information ecosystem, a data and model commons. Something like a new language that allows us to do new things. For example, start new services, create new jobs and business. And altogether we want to lower the barriers to social, economic and political participation. We'll see later, this is important to keep the level of conflict down. But data and model commons is a public good. And we've learned that public goods are threatened by a tragedy of the commons. So we could have data pollution, manipulation, misuse, privacy intrusion, cybercrime, and many more problems. So how to promote responsible use? If we want to open up data that could potentially be misused, then we need first to learn how to promote responsible use. And for this we need to develop, I believe, a trustable web, a self-regulating information ecosystem. That is my claim, that having central regulatory authorities that's trying to control everything is not the solution. It needs to work like the human immune system, basically. Our immune system is a decentralized system, but it's pretty effective to defend itself against all sorts of threats. So here, one more example, maybe I skip for the sake of time, how we can use crowd sensing actually to increase crowd safety. And of course there are many other applications that are quite useful if we would use the data that are now becoming available about human activities for the good of the society and the individual, and not just for the good of companies. So certainly big data are now being created, and that creates big opportunities, also for science. But it's not an easy task. First of all, we need to learn what is the useful information, and that's sometimes like finding the needle in the haystack. So it's a challenge, and it's not just done by computer learning, machine learning, by data mining exercises. It requires also a theoretically informed approach to get an explanatory understanding. So combining data with theories is kind of the real challenge. But there are other challenges, cybercrime, privacy intrusion, security issues, and so on. And that is something that we need to be concerned about. And actually politicians are very concerned about. So 5 years ago, I think probably nobody of us has been using Twitter. I'm not even sure it existed at that time. Now we're talking about Twitter revolutions. Now should we believe that? Has Twitter caused revolutions? Actually, I don't think so, and many others don't think so as well. It could have acted like a catalyst, but it hasn't caused revolutions. And why is that? Because there is actually a mathematical relationship that determines whether there is a transition from an autocratic to a democratic regime. And that depends on the GDP per capita and the fertility, number of children per woman. You can see there's a clear line separating autocratic from democratic regimes. And as the GDP grows, with the economic success of the country, people demand more freedoms, more participation, and you have this transition sooner or later. So that is like a natural law, and it's happening, and that is what was expected to happen actually in the Arabic countries. Just a question now, when does it start? And in the case of the Arabic Revolution, it was a person burning itself. But in the meantime, people have burned themselves in, for example, Italy, and there was no revolution. So you always have basically a combination of circumstances that basically promote a transition, and you have a triggering factor. And it could be a different factor, and this triggering factor determines basically the point in time. In the case of Arabic countries, actually, triggering factors were very much food prices, as you can see over here. When food prices became too high, people were dissatisfied, there were social unrests. So that were basically the driving factors. It was not Twitter, it was not Facebook. But then this happened in London. Everybody was shocked. People said, maybe Twitter is bad, and all this social media and so on. Maybe we should shut it down. I was quite shocked, to read it on the newspaper that democratic countries were considering to shut down the internet. While in Egypt, the minister had said, okay, we shut down the system, and he's done it, he had to go to prison. Now, in the meantime, things have been analyzed, and the conclusion was that shutting down these systems wouldn't have been a good idea and come back to this. But there is a lot of discussion these days about surveillance. Is it a good solution? In many cities, you have more and more cameras. In the UK, it's really an incredible number of cameras. You cannot be anywhere without being recorded by a camera. And there are people who basically dream of this God-eyed view. So this is from a scientific paper, actually. It's American. It's no wonder, of course, this is on the $1 bill. So all Americans have it kind of imprinted in their genes, So could we create God, with information communication systems, something that is supervising us all the time, and when we do a mistake, it would warn us and say, okay, you shouldn't have done it, and punish us right away. Well, this is, of course, this vision of a big brother, and I think it would be terrible. There is no example of a system where it worked well when somebody thought he would know better what would be good for other people. It always ended in disaster. So, no matter whether it's a democratic country or another country, it will not work to have a centralized authority controlling information and deciding what is good for us. And why is that? Because who decides what's right or wrong? Who creates the rules? Each rule creates new rule violators. What was acceptable yesterday will be forbidden today. If you have a certain political opinion and the information power that Google or other companies have, in principle, you could use it to suppress minorities. You could do that if you wanted. And there are certainly people somewhere dreaming of that and trying to get control of that information. So we need to be careful to create infrastructures that would allow people to suppress minorities and other people. In particular, in times of bad economic situation, there will be people asking for some strong person to take control. We have to be very much aware of the possibilities of internet. The internet has totalitarian potential. And also there is a very interesting statement of a criminal officer from Munich, and as a summary of his lifetime experience he said, everyone can become a murderer. You and you and you and you, everybody. Most people who end up killing another person are not criminals. They find themselves in a situation that gets out of control. So we need to be very careful, in order to not to create a system that is too strict. Or take this example, war on terror. Is it freedom fighters or invaders? Hard to tell, depends on perspective. Or follow the bullet ball. So, was it right or wrong? And today, of course, everybody said that it was a great thing to happen. Yeah? But it was not complying with the rules. Certainly not. So, we want to create a system that wouldn't allow such a peaceful revolution to happen. I think it was one of the most important events in German history. Or this, traffic tickets. Is it for establishing safety or filling budget gaps? You can have no opinion, certainly, on this. Another interesting observation is this one. America has discovered prisons as a business opportunity. 1% of people, I would say for this very reason, because you can make money with it, are sitting in prison. 1%. So, it's not a natural law what is right or wrong. But if you give powerful tools into the hands of people with ambitions, political ambitions, they will decide what is right or wrong. And many of you will be potentially people who are not fitting into this vision of the world of that politician. And by the way, actually, social media, of course, has good sides, and we have seen that also in London. The next day, there were hundreds of people clearing the streets. So, it's not just a threat, and the internet is not just full of criminals, not just full of people who do child porn and these kind of things. So, most people are just normal people. Of course, there is crime, but we need to understand much better how crime happens. And in the case of London, there is a clear pattern. So the conflict actually happened in those areas which were deprived. So it was kind of a predictable pattern, but there was again one thing that was triggering those riots, where it was peaceful for a long time. And this event was that, as far as I remember, somebody was shot, and there was not a satisfactory explanation to the public. So those people in this area thought they were mistreated. They were not treated in the way they should be treated. So that created a situation where people lost trust in the authorities. And the authorities lost their authority and their legitimacy in some sense. That's why the riot started. So, even a strong country or government or a king cannot do everything. Basically, governments have certain limits within which they can operate, and apart from that, they must also comply with the social rules, our social norms and values that we believe in. A very interesting example in the street where I'm living, there is a migration office. And for some time, every few weeks or even days, glass was broken. People were angry at the office. And some months later, it turned out there was a big scandal about the way these offices were run. Even the police were kind of frustrated about it. Police said the situation in this migration office is really, I don't know how to translate it.
Devastated.
They're devastated, yeah. So something was wrong here, and that's why people got upset. Now, we are making progress actually in understanding how conflict comes about. So this is a picture actually that shows how social norms were established. It means commonly shared behavior. And it depends on how strong is a population. So a strong population tends to establish the rules and impose them on others, but not always, by the way. So that, and there is an area where basically there is an equilibrium, so everybody can do what he or she likes. Like a big city, everybody is more or less tolerated. And now the interesting point is most conflict doesn't happen here or here, it happens here. I mean, people can basically adjust to two situations. Living in a minority, of course, it's not pleasant to have to adjust to a majority, but most people can do that. And people also are happy with a situation where we have a laissez-faire situation and everybody does what he thinks is right. As long as there is an equilibrium, and most of the time this equilibrium comes about. But when you start with such a situation and then one group becomes stronger and thinks, okay, now we are powerful and can dictate the rules, then that will create the conflict. And we have actually studied data of conflict in one of the conflict-prone areas of the world, Jerusalem. The Middle East is, of course, one of the most serious conflict areas of the world. And based on data, we could come up with agent-based models that allow us to understand the basis of the conflict and also look at different kinds of political scenarios that are under discussion. And it turns out that compared to the business as usual, that means today's situation, the level of conflict could most likely be reduced quite substantially by certain political scenarios. By the way, more or less by all political scenarios that are discussed, also back to 67 and the Palestinian proposal. So what we learned in this study basically is if social distance is small, then integration is a good answer to avoid conflict. If social distance is large, then segregation is a better response. And that is actually relevant because today we are entering an age of personalized information services. And of course, many people like it, but it also creates a filtered bubble. I mean, we don't see the world in the same way. We basically see a world that pleases us, that we like. So we're basically the information that we get confirm our own opinions and maybe prejudices. And that means that basically we are not challenged anymore. So we think we are right because all the information confirms our opinion. And one day we leave our home or office and meet other people and find out they have a different opinion, think they're not normal because suddenly they disagree. So what do you think will happen? Conflict, I guess. So, this kind of beautiful world that confirms us could actually create much more conflict. So I'm coming to the end, and I'd like to point out privacy in contrast to what owners of major internet companies are claiming is important. And I've learned that only as a sociologist, not as a physicist. So I have really a new view on these kind of things, and sociology helps me a lot to understand these things. So basically, there is no public without privacy. Privacy and public are dependent on each other. One thing cannot work without the other. And one of the things that would happen is if you remove privacy, then you remove protected space, where you can be like you are and relax and recover and recharge your batteries and so on. It will create a lot more conflict. Because you will be exposed to others all the time. If you go to a public lake, even there people will segregate to peacefully coexist. Now there's the family beach, there's the beach for people with dogs, the bumpers, the gays, and everybody peacefully coexists through segregation. I see segregation also over the time of day, young people, old people, they use the same infrastructures like shopping centers at different times of the days and so on. That allows us to relax and to interact peacefully. Now if we would all the time be challenged by other people, of course there is no private sphere anymore. We would have to fight all the time for our rights, It would create a lot of conflict. Anyway, we need to protect minorities, we need to protect vulnerable people like judges and politicians. We need to protect social diversity. We've learned that biodiversity is important, and in the same way, social diversity is important. And some of the problems that we see in Europe today are because we have reduced diversity. Diversity in terms of the number of currencies, diversity in terms of the way we produce, diversity in terms of the rules. So everything becomes more and more homogenized. And I think it's bad. The strength of Europe is its diversity. And diversity creates innovation. And innovation creates new economic wealth. So if we reduce diversity, we reduce economic wealth and our ability of the society to adapt to changing situations. So that means diversity is a matter of success and we need to protect it, and that again requires privacy. And there are many other reasons actually. I should also mention this example of my relationship to my parents. I had a diary, like probably many of you had a diary. And I knew I didn't have to lock it away. I could have it on the shelf in my room. And I knew my father and my mother would never open it to read in my diary. That was the basis of my trust relationship to my parents. So, how do you think about a company or a state that looks into everything that you do? Do you trust this company? Do you trust the state? I don't want to know what my staff is doing. What kind of emails they read, what kind of web pages they browse, and so on. I trust them. Yeah? And trust is an important basis, as I said before, for the functioning of society. It's an important social capital, and so it cannot be replaced by surveillance. Also, we've been discussing today about anonymity. Of course, privacy and anonymity and also confidentiality in the business world have something in common. Yeah? We cannot ignore that. And it's sometimes said that anonymity is bad. Yeah? Of course we know anonymity can create bad behaviors, or at least promote or not counter bad behaviors. But it's not a reason to eliminate it completely. I would just like to remind you that the most holy activity of democracies, like voting, is based on anonymous procedure, and we know that those countries who vote non-anonymously are not democracies. So anonymity is important in certain contexts. And in science, for example, we have an anonymous review system. in order to allow our colleagues to make critical remarks on our papers. They wouldn't do so if they thought the next day I would be angry at them because they have criticized my thoughts. So there are places where anonymity is important for the functioning of systems. And there are other places where it can be dangerous. So the issue is to create our internet world, our virtual world in a way that allows us to have privacy, protected space, but not in a way that could have systemic damage. Yeah? Alright, and how to do that? Basically, with socially inspired approaches, we think actually that society can tell us how to do it. Society has many interesting features that we can learn from. And so as we understand society and the principles of self-organization, we can also create a trustable web based on self-regulation and self-control principles. And here's a very nice example, coming back to the social dilemma situation, where we would end up in a tragedy of the commons if everybody would interact with everybody else. We have here 4 strategies: cooperation, cooperators who punish non-cooperative people, non-cooperative people, and non-cooperative people who punish other non-cooperative people. And the punishing cooperators are shown in green. Red is again the non-cooperative, and blue the cooperative. So what you can see over here is that in the beginning, red dominates. And if you would extrapolate that into the future, you would say, oh, you know, our world is going to run into big, big trouble. But then a wonder happens, a very big surprise. We eventually end up with those people who cooperate. And it happens because of segregation. Because the problem is that if those punishing cooperators are interacting with cooperators, they cannot compete with them because they have a punishment cost. So the cooperators spread as compared to the punishing cooperators. But those cooperators cannot compete with the non-cooperative people because, you know, they don't have to pay a price, but they also participate in the benefits of society. So they're basically cheating and free riding, and so they would spread, as we can see over here. But the punishing cooperators have a trick to keep down those cheating people. Of course, punishment basically can impose a cost on them, and that suppresses their spreading. Now, what happens over here is through segregation, basically, the punishing cooperators, which we call moralists, they can survive. Of course, they don't have to compete directly anymore with the cooperators. They compete with the non-cooperative red people over here. And that is actually the mechanism that allows cooperation to spread. So this is a completely decentralized approach. It does not require a police state or something, or a big brother to create cooperation. It can be reached in a decentralized way if you have the right rules, and it could also be a reputation system, by the way. So in conclusion, we are entering an age of big data. And data is the new oil, as people say. But models are the new gold, and participation means social capital. And things are not as easy as you think. You know, we have many new opportunities opening up in the future. But we can do things right or wrong. We can do things terribly wrong, actually, if we don't understand how to do things right. But for sure, society needs to take decisions what it wants. And we need to look also in the areas where things are hard to understand and not intuitive. We need to stop searching where the light is, and then we can enter a bright future.